Okay, thank you all so much for coming and welcome to the Together in the UK Storytelling Awards. So what I want to do as an introduction is tell you a bit about Together in the UK, then give you some reflections on running a storytelling competition. This is the first one we did, so we've got some thank yous to say, and then I want to introduce you to the programme. So, first of all, Together in the UK is a storytelling platform for people who've immigrated to the UK. What we do is we share insights about what it is like to immigrate here in order to help other people making the journey. We want to say, we hear you, we respect the courage and resilience it takes to start a life in another country. Recently we looked for qualitative feedback on what we were doing, and a really quite moving comment came back to me which said, I didn't think anyone would be interested in my story. But I want to say is we so are. I also want to tell you now a little bit about organising a storytelling competition. It's an awful lot of work, and you cannot do it on your own. I'm going to paraphrase Hillary Clinton and tell you it takes an incredible village to make it happen. You will hear from some of the high-profile judges who are prepared to back us this evening. There's lots of members of Together in the UK team here this evening, people managing with catering, people doing all kinds of things who helped put this evening together, and some who sadly can't make it tonight, who made it happen. They worked on the website, they promoted it on social media, and they helped with the organisation of the project. A huge, huge thank you to Union Chapel for their generosity in allowing us to host the awards in this really, really beautiful venue. Thank you to Marshall's e-learning and the W Group sponsoring prizes, and most importantly of all, thank you to the people who entered the competition, who trusted us with their insight, their creativity, and taught us so much about the joy and pain of immigration. Of course, it's a competition, so not everyone can be a winner. But if you have not won this evening, that's not it. We put forward 10 poems to a publisher, and her response was they are all publishable. So we're going to find a way of publishing more entries than just the winners. We hold poetry hours with timepiece, so we'll be emailing to say, are you up for reading your poem in public? And we'll be writing to different authors to say, can we publish your piece on our website? There were so many powerful pieces, far more than the winners. But the winners were really good. And nobody knows, apart from the judges, who the winners are till tonight. This evening we're starting with a keynote speaker, and then we're going to announce the competition winners. The different judges will be announcing the competition winners. You will hear music from Ben Mayo, from the Smart Cash Band, and towards the end of the evening, Ogo Ajala will sing for us. We've also decided that rather than ask the winners to read their entry, we've asked the actor Sadiqa Esmail to read all the winning entries for us. This is because the announcement of the winners is made on the night, and so people couldn't prepare, and also for COVID restrictions, so we'll just use one microphone. I'm incredibly excited, and we are quite honoured that Jonathan Portes has agreed to be our keynote speaker. Jonathan is a professor of economics and public policy. He's a major writer on economics, an author of the book Immigration, What Do We Know and What Should We Do? I'm one of over his 72,000 followers on Twitter, and it's always a pleasure to see his pithy comments on government policy and other reports. So I'm now going to hand over to Jonathan for his keynote talk. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that very kind introduction, Teresa, and thank you for inviting me, and it's a privilege and an honour to be able to contribute to this. I won't say anything more about the storytelling competition, because I'm presenting one of the categories later, so I'll save my views on that for that. I'm not an immigrant myself. My parents are. They came to this country shortly before I was born. Many other members of my extended family are also immigrants, or the children or grandchildren of immigrants. And I've lived in London not quite all my life, but 50 years or so now. Of course, I not only live near here, about a mile from here, but we moved here when I was 5, and I was brought up and grew up not far from here, perhaps 10 minutes walk from here. And I've seen both this neighbourhood and the city of London change beyond measure in the 50 years that I have lived here, in very large part because of immigration. And on the whole, I think that those changes and the influence of immigration has been hugely positive for London, for Londoners, all of us, wherever we came from, however we got here. But that is a subjective view, and one shouldn't shy away from that. So a sort of preface that when I talk about the history, politics and economics of immigration, I do so as an academic, as someone who's thought about this a lot and researched on it for the best part of 20 years, but equally I come to it with my own prejudices and perspectives, and I think it's incumbent on all of us who do that to be honest about that. We bring our own personal baggage to this, again, whether from whatever background we come. I'm not going to give, this is a very, very brief summary of the book that Teresa talked about. Obviously it's going to be very brief indeed. But I do say that I do think, although I'm an economist, I really do think it's important to think a bit about the history here. I'm not a historian, I don't pretend to be an expert in the bit in my book that talks about history is not a scholarly work in the same sense that the economics bits are by any means. On the other hand, if you don't know your history, you really do not know where we all are coming from in this context. And so I start perhaps 1,000 years ago when the Normans arrived here, and the Normans invited the Jews, possibly the first actual immigration policy decision the British government ever took. However, that did not go so well in the subsequent 2 centuries, and the Jews were famously expelled after a series of pogroms in the 12th century. Then there was, skipping forward, people from abroad made a huge, there was a huge influx of refugees, particularly, as many of you probably know, for a bit at least from history, the Huguenots, as well as not that long after the arrival and assimilation of Britain's first black citizens. And one story I do often tell, which goes back to when I was working on migration policy at the very end of the 20th century in the Cabinet Office. The then Immigration Minister, Barbara Roche, got a letter from the leader of Kent County Council, who was complaining that there were too many asylum seekers landing up in Kent. A complaint, of course, which has been in our newspapers again in the last few weeks, as it happens. But one thing that he said struck me, which was that in this letter he wrote, Kent has no prior history of multicultural diversity. And the sort of ignorance of history, of our history that displays, because in fact Dover in Kent was represented in Parliament by a Huguenot refugee as far back as the 17th century. And I think seeing the way that history rhymes and loops around itself on this topic is one of the most fascinating things that one knows about. So, going forward to the 19th century was really when immigration as a mass concept began. The end of the 19th century was the greatest episode of mass migration the world has ever seen. And Britain was mostly a country of emigration then, especially Ireland, but Britain too, people leaving for the New World. But it was also a time when many people arrived here, particularly Jews. Next slide. I do like showing this slide. So this is an election leaflet from the end of the 19th century from the Conservative candidate and later MP, Mr. Bownegri, who became MP briefly for Bethnal Green. Again, not very far from here, perhaps a couple of miles at most. And this is what he said about in his election leaflet. I hope some of you at least can read that. One of the principal causes of increased house rent in East London, foreign pauper aliens, by which of course he meant basically Jews. It's in slightly archaic language, but essentially the arguments here are pretty much the same arguments that we heard about East Europeans, especially over the last 10 or 15 years or so. Ironic again that this was a Conservative MP, but somebody who of course himself was obviously of migrant origin. Moving forward now to where we are now, how we got here, where we are now. The story of Windrush is well known, as well as the other great migrations of the post-war area. But there are still many competing narratives for this around here. Was there really ever free movement in the Commonwealth? Was immigration a product of government policy or the labour market? Famously, of course, Enoch Powell himself went to Jamaica to try and recruit nurses from the NHS before subsequently deciding that actually this was not something he wanted to see in this country. And to what extent is immigration the legacy of empire, the subject of a number of recent books, and of course central to some of the politicized discussions we've been having about our own history over the last year or two in particular. So what happens now? I think beyond Brexit, we are once again engaged in this discussion about who we are and the extent to which the sort of myth of a homogenous English or British character or nationality or makes any sense. That discussion has been contested for a very long time, and we're seeing it contested again now. And we will see whether this openness, the openness of 1997 and onwards, was an aberration, or whether we will close back on ourselves, as we have done periodically through history, as we did, for example, in the 70s and early 80s. These things do go in cycles. History does go round. I'm still, on the whole, optimistic, though, and I'll just finish, I think, with saying one thing, which I think, yesterday, or today at midnight, was the close of applications for the European Union Settlement Scheme for people who, for European Union citizens living here to register for permanent residence. So quite an important moment. And I and others have written about the issues with the scheme, the problems, the worries about people who may fall through it. Some people talk about a new Windrush scandal. I hope that will not happen, but there are certainly plenty to be worried about. But stepping back from that more broadly, the big news about the settlement scheme is simply the number of people who've registered. That approximately 5.6 million people will get new statistics tomorrow, I'm told, when it will probably hit closer to 6 million. And close to 6 million people have applied for this scheme. Far more than we ever thought was possible. And the vast majority of them have been granted permanent residence in this country. That, I think, just as the Windrush generation and other people from the Commonwealth changed the UK UK, so the European British or British Europeans will change us too. It took, and that change takes a very, very long time. When Russia arrived in 1947, and unrestricted migration from the Commonwealth ended in 1962, but you didn't have the first black or South Asian descendant of that generation enter Parliament until 1987. So while we've had Brexit, and while European migration will not be what it was going forward, the impact of the fact that we have 4 or 5 million people here who've come here in the last 20 years who intend, a very large proportion of them intend to settle and make their lives here, that too will change the character of this country going forward in ways which we probably can't anticipate yet. So we will see another chapter of that history is very much still to be written. Brexit is not a full stop, it's just another punctuation mark, and I'll stop there.